Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is Daily Drop number 168. Hey, what's going on, everybody? So, tonight we have an article from the St. John Source, and that's an outlet from down in the Virgin Islands. And we have some more news about the battle for Jeffrey Epstein's estate. So, the headline for this article is AG says Epstein Estate proposal would deny some abuse victims rights. The author of this article is Judy Schimmel. Legal efforts to protect the rights of women claiming they were sexually abused as children by the late Jeffrey Epstein hit a new impasse in recent weeks. This according to the head of the Virgin Islands Department of Justice. A spokesperson for Attorney General Denise George released a statement late last week offering a glimpse of those efforts. I'm not a big fan of Denise George. I'm on record here on the podcast with that line of thinking, and I don't think her motivations are as pure as she might be letting on here. It would be one thing if she was charging this hard and there was no questions asked about where the money was going to end up. But the fact that she always says that the Virgin Islands are also a victim inside of this sordid play, it bothers me because it definitely means that she's angling for that money and she believes that the Virgin Islands, who, let's not forget, folks, okay? I'm not saying her in particular. I'm sure Denise George is a good woman, right? I'm not saying she's a bad person or anything like that. What I am saying is this. The people that came before her, the people that were in charge when Epstein was up to his criminality, well, they were official representatives of the Virgin Islands. They were elected officials of the Virgin Islands. So they're enabling him and them being complicit basically with his behavior. That automatically should tell you that the Virgin Islands were not victims in this enterprise. Now, is it bad for the people of do the people of the Virgin Islands, do they probably feel disgusted by it all? Of course they do. Of course they do. All right-thinking people worldwide feel that way. But the government inside of the Virgin Islands, come on, all we have to do is read the articles and see the donations and see the connections, and we could see exactly what occurred. We know that Epstein was paying for that protection in the Virgin Islands, and for them to come out after the fact, after they've wet their beak already on the front end, and think that on the back end, now that there's more money that's coming out, now that there's going to be a lawsuit, for them to think that they're going to, wet their beak twice, it's appalling to me. Along with the statement came a status update filed March 18th in Superior Court. In the statement, George said Justice wants to see the Survivor Settlement Fund proposed by the St. Thomas law firm representing Epstein's estate finalized. But the conditions set by the executors of the estate would deny some survivors their legal rights, she said. And look, I'm on record also with Indike and Khan. I don't think there are any heroes in this whole entire story down here in the Virgin Islands, except the lawyers who are pushing forward on the behalf of the survivors. Those are the only people that are truly pushing for justice here. I'd love to say that, Denise George, her only motivation is just justice, and her only motivation is seeing these people brought to heel. But I don't think that's her only motivation, and that's what we can come up with from her own statements. And words matter, right? The way you say things, the releases that you make, the things you say to the press. When you're somebody like Denise George in a position like hers, you're not just throwing up a bunch of word salad, right? It's very rare that somebody who is in a position like she is in isn't savvy, isn't somebody that knows how to navigate the press. They're not going to just toss out a bunch of word salad that doesn't have meaning, right? And all we can do is take her at her word. And what she's saying is that the Virgin Islands is entitled to some of the money that the survivors should be getting. And in my opinion, I find that to be atrocious, and I find it to be gross. Government attorneys challenging the probate are demanding the settlement fund hold enough financial resources to accommodate claimants who file over a period of several years. They want an expert on child sexual abuse to help administer the fund. They also want to eliminate a provision that would force claimants to surrender the right to hold accountable third parties who may have played roles in their abuse. All of that is good stuff, right? When they're right, they're right. And Denise George going for this style and going in this direction is something I can definitely get behind. I've said numerous times, I can't even tell you how many times I've said it, and not just on the podcast, but just in conversations with people when we're talking about this case. The fact that them getting money out of this trust would make it so their story isn't theirs to tell, or that they couldn't go after third parties who played a role in the abuse, I always found it repugnant. And the fact that they're bringing it up here, that the prosecution's bringing it up here and making it a sticking point, is super important, folks. It is very important, because that gives the people like the Core Four, what it does, it gives them something to think about, right? It pulls the rug of security right from underneath their feet. And it also lets everybody else know that the government means business. And again, I want to get on board with Denise George. I want to, cheer her and say, hey, look, this is a woman who's doing the right thing. Her motivations are in the right place. And I'm willing to have my opinion changed as we go forward with this. Maybe she'll reconsider her decision to try and get some money for the Virgin Islands out of this trust when all is said and done. And if that's the case, and her motivations end up being pure, and the motivation is truly justice, well, I'll sing her praises on the podcast the same way I give credit to anybody who I believe is doing the right thing. But all of those points that we just discussed, that we just talked about here, are very important. Very important. And the most important, in my opinion, is that the girls are able to go after third-party individuals who might have taken part in the abuse or in the procurement or the grooming process, etc., etc. These concerns and others were included in a February 10th letter written by George to the law firm representing the estate. When no reply came by February 24th, the Attorney General said she pursued the matter by setting up talks between the parties. The Attorney General's concerns focused on improving the program to protect the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and conform to the laws and public policy of the Virgin Islands, the March 18th filing said. When the estate's lawyers kept silent, Justice then sought out the survivors who have already come forward to find out what they would consider fair treatment from settlement fund administrators. And I like this strategy as well. Why not have the survivors involved? Why not have their lawyers involved? If anybody knows the suffering that they've been through, it's them and their lawyers, right? Let's talk to them directly. Why do we need Indike and Khan and even the people who administered the 9/11 fund? Why do we need them to come here and put a price tag on what these girls have went through? It should be completely independent. And I understand that people will say, oh, well, the 9/11 people, they're independent. I don't believe so. It's a New York organization. There's too many ties. There has to be somebody who is completely impartial, somebody or somebodies who are completely impartial and have no dog in the fight, and just they're there to administer the funds from the estate and to dole them out in a proper fashion. And with Indike and Khan being the ones who are in charge of that, I have zero faith that that's going to occur. And even if they bring in one of these funds, like the 9/11 people, I forget the exact name, but if they bring them in, you're going to tell me they don't have, they've never worked together before, they haven't rubbed elbows at parties. I don't trust anybody from New York at this point when it comes to this case. If you're somebody who operated in New York, in the New York quote-unquote high society or polite society, then I don't trust you at this point, because what we have seen is if you have not been involved in the abuse directly, you have definitely enabled the abuse. And it goes for just about every single person who runs in these circles at this point. To balance the interests of the estate and those claiming to have suffered sexual abuse, Justice wants to bring in a subject expert to serve alongside the estate's program administrator. Attempts to establish a role for Professor Marcy Hamilton have been less successful, George said. Hamilton's involvement was proposed to Justice during discussions with women who have already filed legal claims against the state and their attorneys. The professor is considered an expert on statute of limitations in child sex abuse cases. She also heads a nonprofit called Child USA, which advocates for child sex abuse survivors and is a leading researcher on the subject. Now, I'm not familiar with this group, this organization, and I'm not familiar with Marcy Hamilton either. Sorry, I was trying to find her name. I'm not familiar with Marcy Hamilton either, but from what they're saying here, if she's such a leading person in the field and she's somebody that could add some clarity and somebody that can be an impartial voice or somebody who knows exactly what they're looking at when they look at, the overall picture of the abuse that happened to these ladies, that these ladies lived through, then I think that she could be a very important part of the puzzle. Why wouldn't they want her involved unless, of course, Indike and Khan don't want to have somebody who is a professional when it comes to these things overlooking what's going on? And that would be my guess, because Khan and Indike are just beyond scummy in my opinion. The proposal was submitted to the estate, and Justice received a response. In the status report, George complains that Epstein's legal representatives would not allow Hamilton to serve as a co-administrator and wanted to limit her role as an advisor in the case. Again, why would they want that? What are they so scared of? If Khan and Indike are just being transparent and their sole goal is to administer and be the executors of the estate and do it fairly, without any sort of, scumbaggery, then they wouldn't mind Miss Hamilton being part of the team. They wouldn't mind having an expert give them her learned advice, her intelligent overview on what's going on or what should occur. Why would they resist that unless they have something to hide as well? What they want is to be in charge of the whole entire shebang. Chief among those complaints was the estate's position that the advocate be prevented from speaking to any of those claiming that Epstein abused them when they were minors. In one case, claimant says she was sexually abused at the age of 13. Yeah, there's no way. Again, they don't even want her to speak to the survivors. They don't want her to have a talk with them. Why? What? Khan and Indike cannot have this much power over this estate. There has to be something that can be done. Again, I'm not a legal guy, right? I didn't go to law school, none of that jazz. I'm just a guy who's had enough, and if they can find loopholes to keep themselves out of jail all the time, then loopholes should be able to be found to actually put them underneath the microscope too. Because, enough is enough with these people. As a concession, the Attorney General said claimants and Justice would consider modifying the role they wanted Hamilton to play, but were not willing to have her participation rendered useless. They counter-proposed having the advocate weigh in on case-by-case considerations of victims' claims in the settlement process. And I don't, that's a good counter-proposal, right? I think that works as well, but I'd prefer, if they're going to bring in a specialist like this Dr. Hamilton, then I'd prefer her to be, involved from the very get, from, all the decision-making. Let her do what she does. Why are you going to give her a shortened role in something so important? Again, George said, the executor seemed unwilling to compromise. It just goes to show you that Indike and Khan they can't be trusted in this, right? As much as I'm not a fan of Denise George, I trust her a lot more than I trust Indike and Khan. So I'm falling down on her side, obviously, of this tiff here. And I think that everything that she's asking has not been less than reasonable, right? She's asked for very reasonable things, very reasonable concessions. And the only problem I have with Denise George, obviously, is the money aspect. But when it comes to what she's doing here, I'm totally on board with what she's doing here. She would not be permitted to share any concerns about the program with individual survivors, their counsel, the Attorney General, or even the court. In essence, Professor Hamilton would receive 2 telephone calls a month from the administrator, and she would be told whatever the administrator chooses to share. Why does the estate not want to allow her to review the files, participate in meetings with survivors, and provide her thoughts, suggestions, and opinions? That's a very good question. And obviously we know why, right? They'll find some legal loophole that they'll argue, and they'll fight tooth and nail for this not to occur, but eventually they're going to have to concede, because they really don't hold the high ground here. Indike and Khan better be very, very careful of the moves they're making, because they're putting themselves in the spotlight, and they're also opening themselves up to a lot of people taking a deeper look into who they are. All right, a lot of interest into who they are and what they're up to and what their real role was in this. So they better be very, very careful whose toes they're stepping on, because as much as I'm not a huge fan of Denise George, she is an attorney general, and this is where the will was set up and where the trust was set up. So she does wield an extreme amount of power, and for Indyke and Khan to play games with her, I think they're making a mistake. Why does the estate not want to use the expertise and knowledge Professor Hamilton is willing to share? George said. Since then, representatives of the estate have expressed their views in an article published over the weekend in the New York Post. The March 20th article quotes statements by attorney Matthew Aronson in a legal brief filed in Manhattan Surrogate Court. Aronson said the estate wants to see a lawsuit citing provisions of the Child Victims Act dismissed because 6 of 9 claimants were over age 18 when they had their sexual encounters with Epstein. This is how sick these people are. This is the lawyer for the estate, okay? It's not bad enough that we all know that Epstein was guilty, okay? Not bad enough that we all know that. Now, they're using the line, well, some of them were over age, they were adults, so it's okay that they were raped or they were molested or they were abused. No, none of it's okay. None of it's okay. And for them to try and get this stuff thrown out on these technicalities and with these loopholes, it launches me into orbit. It is a page right out of the Alan Dershowitz playbook, and it makes me mental. I can't stand the way they find these loopholes and attempt to exploit them. So what has to happen is, in my opinion, obviously, Denise George has to be very, very forceful. She has to be like a bulldog. She has to go charge hard and make sure that Indyke and Khan are not the ones calling the shots here. She can't be bullied by them. She can't be worried about getting caught up in court proceedings with them. She just has to charge forward and go for the jugular. Because if these idiots are in charge of administering the funds and then they can bring in the people that they want, we know that the survivors are just going to be victimized once again. They're just going to be abused once again, and this time by the estate of the same man who abused them for decades and got away with it. How is that right? Isn't this about justice? Isn't that what this all comes down to, justice, and making sure that those who were involved are held responsible? So let's make sure it happens. Let's make sure it happens, Denise George. Make sure you're using every single tool in your arsenal, every weapon in your arsenal, to make sure that these people are brought to justice for what they have done and what they obviously continue to still do. If you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All right, everybody, I will be back tomorrow with the usual morning update and the daily drop. Have a great evening, everyone.